Today we're going to talk about some views or a view related to animal rights and a little bit, we'll touch briefly on speciesism, but the topic is labeled speciesism because the readings here are just about the way in which humans treat and even tend to think about non-human animals. So organisms, in particular animals, mammals, from other species. Factory farming, so cows, pigs, chickens, these kinds of things. I guess not necessarily all mammals, but animals that we even deer and other kinds of birds that are often hunted, and then things like rats and mice, and maybe even other kinds of mammals like dogs or monkeys that are used in research. Okay, so we're going to talk about animal rights, and this is a paper from Tom Regan, who was in the latter third or so of the 20th century. Important in the animal rights movement, along with Peter Singer, who is a utilitarian who talks a lot about animal welfare. So we'll talk about this view and give Tom Regan's argument for why we should be abolitionists about these things, and his view. What will be interesting for us about his view is that it is unlike Singer's, which is probably a more popularly talked about view, is not based in suffering and pain and the welfare. What's often called the welfare. It's not based in the welfare of the animals that are in, for instance, factory farming or research. So it's about rights. It's about animals having rights not to be harmed and treated in certain ways, rather than the treatment creating all of this suffering. Okay, that's going to be the main thrust, which is kind of the interesting part. All right, so let's give it a start. So Regan starts by talking about what the proper goals should be for advocating for animals. So the advocacy for what is often called animal rights was right, coming up in the time. I honestly, I can't remember if it's the 60s or 70s, but somewhere in there where, a lot of these kinds of issues were being talked about more loudly. Civil rights was around, and so obviously there were people who were just thinking about rights and our behaviors and our institutions that we had going, and animal rights was a topic. And Regan was very interested in this, but he thought, okay, look, here's what seem to be the goals of what he thinks should be the goals of the animal rights movement. Okay, and they are strong. They're very strong. They're very stringent. He thought the first goal was the total abolition of using animals in research. We just should not use animals in research at all. That's what he thinks. Okay. Secondly, we should not have any commercial agricultural, animal agriculture, factory farming. Okay. The total dissolution of, well, I guess not even just factory farming for sure, but any commercial animal agriculture. So, just farming where you're selling meat, selling animal products for profit, raising and then either killing or using animals to make profit off of their meat or other of their products like their eggs or whatever. Total dissolution of that, and the total elimination of commercial and sport hunting. Okay. So we shouldn't be using animals in research. We shouldn't be raising animals on farms so that we can eat them or use them for our gustatory pleasures. And we should not be killing them, whether commercially or just for sport in our backyard or down at the ranch or whatever. All right. Those are the three goals. Pretty extreme. It's not like, we should not hurt them as much. No, it's like total abolition of all these things. Okay. So he wants to start by saying, look, here's, as I was just saying, here's the kind of common way in which people have been abdicating for animals. It's based on their welfare, pain and suffering, right? He says, there's some evidence, but this is the main way in which people argue for getting rid of factory farming, for being vegetarian, whatever else, is because of all the suffering that's caused by it. And in particular, they focus on factory farming, the more extreme version of this. That's usually what people focus on. You don't see much on this, and you certainly don't see much on this. A lot of people, at least in lay conversation, popular conversation, but I've heard myself, these anecdotes, but I've heard myself, a lot of people, I've heard this so much from students and from friends as well, say, well, I would hunt myself. I would get it myself if it were easier. I agree, like, factory farming's bad. I try to buy local or whatever, and I would just like farm myself or hunt myself because that's probably just the more humane way. And Regan's like, no, there's no difference there. I have a colleague who, my friend and colleague Travis Timmerman, who had, I believe, I'm not sure if he ended up publishing this paper, but it was a presentation that he gave, I think a poster presentation at a conference, where he argued that hunting animals was worse than factory farming. Like going and killing a deer that's living out in the wild was a worse wrong than some of the wrongs in factory farming. So it's interesting. But okay, in any case, welfare tends to be the concern. Lots of suffering produced, lots of terrible lives lived in factory farming. We just want to reduce their pain and suffering. Where there's a lot of needless pain and suffering is oftentimes the thrust of the argument. So utilitarians, as we've seen, are those who think that the wrong action is the one that produces the most suffering. The right action is the one that produces the most good. And therefore, so they hold that it's wrong to treat animals in ways that harm them or cause them suffering when there are better alternatives. Right? And Regan thinks, well, this goes some way towards achieving these things because these things produce a lot of suffering and pain, right? However, Regan thinks you can't get the total abolition of research, total dissolution of agriculture, animal agriculture, or the total elimination of commercial or sport hunting, killing of these animals in the wild. You can't get that. Why? Well, because resting your view on welfare allows that you're able to inflict harm, if the overall benefits of doing so are good enough, right? And this is often the justification, especially for research. We can cure cancer, we can cure Alzheimer's, we can even more minimally, we can get a really good understanding of how drugs are going to affect the brain because rat and mice brains are really similar to ours in a lot of ways. And so we can learn a lot about the other social animals. We can learn a lot about mental disorders, genetic basis of mental disorders, treatment for mental disorders by testing animals. And that's fairly true. We don't know a lot about mental disorders despite all the research right now, but there's a lot we don't know about mental disorders, and there's a lot that's still kind of iffy and very conditional, but that's just science, we just progresses slowly, and it's trial and error a lot, and we have learned a lot. However, we have to harm and often kill animals in order to get that. And that's just the question, right? It's outweighing goods. If you rest the argument against using animals in research, killing them for factory farming, killing them for fun or whatever, hunting, if you rest that on welfare, you're going to get this worry that all you need to do is really reduce harm, right? Not eliminate factory farming, not eliminate animal research, but just be careful, reduce harm as much as you can in order to get the benefits that we want, like having really tasty steaks. It's not clear that's even a relevant benefit, but learning things from research for sure, respecting people's rights, I guess. And human welfare is often just thought to count for more, obviously. So that's very, very common. And so even if you have animal welfare that you respect, you're still fighting against the fact that you can harm things that count morally as long as you get enough good out of it. And the human welfare is worth a lot more. So when you get human benefits for animal suffering, you can get more suffering for less benefit because human welfare counts for more. Right. So Regan wants to say, really, there's something else that we should be thinking about here, and that's the violation of the animal's rights. Right? It's the respect for their rights and not welfare that's going to get us these goals here. The more stringent absolutist goals of total abolition, which is what he wants. And welfare is not going to get us that, right? But he says, listen, I think welfare is super important. Utilitarians have something really, really right. Not that welfare is the only thing that matters. That's what they get wrong. But what they get right is that welfare is incredibly important. And animal welfare as well. It can make an action much worse if you produce more suffering, right? Focusing on rights, though, moves the issue from going case by case, which is what utilitarians have to do. How much suffering is produced by this action, right? To an analysis of the whole system. That's going to be another benefit, right? We can look at the system as a whole and not just what each individual animal is experiencing. And the fundamental flaw, if you take this rights view, the fundamental flaw of these things, research, agriculture, and hunting, is that they view animals as resources. Things to be used for us, for our benefit, for our purposes. We can treat them in ways that just however we want, as long as it satisfies our interests, which count for more on the welfare view, typically. And that's going to be a fundamental flaw if animals have rights. Okay. So this is going to just unearth, just totally upheave these systems of research, animal agriculture, and animal hunting, okay? Because those systems just tend to treat them as resources to be used as we want. And if we can't do that, it's going to be a total upheaval of those systems. Okay. So Regan, so that's the setup. That is animals as resources and the way in which we can undermine that system. Not through welfare, but through rights. Okay. All right. Now he wants to look at this is against being against animal rights. So if you're against animal rights, Regan wants to consider some ways that you might reject animal rights, and he's going to be against those. He's going to show problems with those. So he wants to say, look, here's some things, some ways to deny this, and I'm going to show that they fail. Okay. So first, you might deny that we have any direct duties to animals. That is to say, we don't have a duty that's directly related to particular animals or to animals in general. There are no direct duties to animals, right? Instead, you might think there's duties regarding animals or duties that entail things about animals. Okay, so we might have a duty not to perform certain actions, and then these actions sometimes involve animals or have consequences for animals. But the duty is about the action, not the animal. It's not that the animal has rights. It's about certain actions. Okay? So for example, it might be wrong to kick your neighbor's dog, but that might only be wrong because it disrespects property. Someone's property. Or maybe it's wrong because it upsets you and makes you sad. There might be different ways for it to be wrong without the animal having rights, right? It's not in virtue of the dog itself having rights that have been violated. And so this is a way in which you might think you can have some kind of good treatment of animals, but Regan's wrong because animals don't have rights. That's what you might think. And he says, look, you can't justify, rationally at least, these indirect duty views that only sometimes you should not do things to animals, but not because of anything about the animal itself. There's no direct duties to animals. Right? And this way of denying the rights to animals is going to fail because there's no good way to justify it. So he says, first, look, it's irrational to deny that animals feel pain. That's crazy, he thinks. And so that can't be why there's no direct duty to animals. Well, maybe their pain is less valuable than humans, and that's why there's no direct duty to animals. He's like, well, that's crazy too. Pain is pain. It's just about degrees of pain. It's not like if a dog and a human are experiencing the same degree of pain, if their experience of the pain is the same in terms of its intensity, its duration, it doesn't matter who has it. That's the same pain. Okay, so that can't be the reason for denying it. So, however you deny that animals have rights, there's different ways to deny that. You can't do it by saying that there's no direct duty to animals. You have to accept that. You have to recognize that some duties are directly to animals themselves. And there are two views he considers that try to deny rights to animals, but not by denying direct duties. Okay. So some try to say there's no direct duty to animals. And he's like, no, that's not going to work. So let's see if anyone else can deny rights to animals without denying direct duties. Okay, a second view denies animals have rights, okay, but it's about humans have, this view denies that animals have the same rights as humans. That's what it is. Okay, but it's just that we have a duty to be kind to them and not to be cruel to them. So we do have a duty to be kind to animals, and we have a duty not to be cruel to them. So this respects the direct duty idea. So there are some direct duties to animals, but animals don't have the same rights as humans. Okay, that's why we can treat them as a resource. So it denies animal rights in Regan's sense, because Regan thinks if animals have rights, we can't use them as resources. And this view says, the cruelty-kindness view says, well, we do have duties to animals, but they don't have rights like we do. And so it's still going to be okay to treat them as a resource sometimes, as long as we're kind to them and not directly cruel to them. Okay, so this avoids the worries here with direct duty, right? But it says animals don't have rights like humans do, not the same rights. All right. So he says this is bad. Kindness and cruelty are insufficient. He objects, he rejects this view because kindness and cruelty cannot settle the question of whether we're doing right or wrong. Okay. Kindness and cruelty are not enough. So appealing to these is not going to be able to tell us whether our treatment of animals is right or wrong. Okay, it can't tell us that. Why is kindness not enough? Well, look, imagine a racist who's really, really kind, but only to members of his own race. So when the racist is kind, he's not doing the right thing. Okay, so kindness can't guarantee rightness. So if we're kind to animals, respecting this duty, we still don't know if we're acting rightly or wrongly towards them. So this kind of view, the cruelty-kindness view, is not enough, because whether we're cruel or kind doesn't tell us whether we're right or wrong. Kindness can't do it, but cruelty can't do it. Okay. So you might think those who support abortions or perform abortions even, they might not be cruel, right? It might be the case that they're not acting cruelly, but that doesn't tell us whether they're right or wrong. They might still be performing a wrong action, even though they're not trying to be cruel, right? They might just be confused about morality. So the absence of cruelty does not guarantee rightness. Okay, therefore, kindness and cruelty are not enough. Okay, so that's the problem with that view. All right, what about utilitarianism? This denies that people have rights. Okay, this denies that people and animals have rights. It's the view that everyone's pain, every being's pain, counts as the same, and the right action is the one that maximizes well-being, minimizes suffering for the greatest number of beings who feel pain and suffering. Okay, to act by act. Everyone counts the same. Everyone's interest counts the same. But it allows direct duties based on the consequences. We have a duty to treat sentient creatures in a way that increases the overall maximized well-being. That increases the overall well-being for all those sentient creatures. That seems to get you direct duties, maybe. What's the problem here, though? Well, the problem here, says Regan, is that, let me go slower. The problem here is that it doesn't respect individuals, animals or humans. Okay. It doesn't respect the inherent value of individuals, what Regan calls subjects of a life. An ant is the subject of a life. If it has any degree of consciousness, it's the subject of a life. It's not a very rich life, but it is still the subject of a conscious experience, a life. Okay. And we don't get the inherent value of people even on consequentialism. It's just about the consequences, not the intrinsic value of people. Okay. Only the overall satisfaction or frustration of the relevant interests related to pain and suffering, those are the only things that matter. And he thinks that's a problem. If you don't have respect for individuals, you get a problem. People, any sentient being really, people, animals, on utilitarianism are just merely vessels for well-being. They're like containers. You as the person you don't count. It's about the well-being you experience. Okay. And like a cup that can hold poison or it can hold refreshing water, the cup doesn't matter. It's just about what's inside it. It's about the contents. And so humans themselves, the individuals, don't matter. It's just about their well-being and their suffering. And really, it's about the overall well-being and suffering. Right? Overall happiness. And so if someone has more interests satisfied, then they're worth more. Because it's about overall counting up of well-being. Now, because individuals don't matter, Regan wants to point out, he's like, look, on utilitarianism, you're going to lose the value of individuals for the whole mass, and the whole mass only in terms of their well-being and suffering, right? This is going to allow people to be used. It's going to allow morally permissible actions where you're using people for the benefit of others. So as long as the overall consequences are good, then using that person to create those good consequences is going to be permissible on utilitarianism. There are going to be cases where you can kill someone to save 5, or you can scapegoat somebody to stop a riot, right? That's going to be okay as long as the overall consequences are good. Okay, you can even harm people to do that if the overall benefits are good. And if we want to resist using people, then we need to say something other than maximizing well-being is important. This, Regan thinks, is best going to be done by invoking rights. Rights against being used. You have a claim against other people that they not use you to benefit someone else. Utilitarianism is insufficient because it can't account for this, says Regan. All right, now the positive case. So again, this is kind of against people who want to deny rights to animals. And so he's tried to give a negative case. Now the positive case. Why should we think animals have rights? Well, we're more than just receptacles. Okay, we're more than just vessels for well-being. People are. Okay. The utilitarian has a lot going for it. It's really been beneficial in helping the animal rights movement, or the animal welfare movement, really. The fair treatment, the fair and just treatment of animals. Like better treatment of animals. Animal welfareists have done a really great job, like Singer. But they're missing something. This inherent worth of the individual animal. Just like the inherent worth of humans. Okay. Individuals are valuable independently of their human suffering. Independently of their suffering and happiness. Not just humans. Individual beings. Okay. What makes that true? Well, we'll see. All right. Regan wants to modify the egalitarian claim. So the utilitarian says everyone's interests count for the same, so much as they are beings capable of experiencing suffering and happiness. But he wants to say, well, it's not just that. Okay, the inherent value of individuals is also equal. Not just their interests in terms of their suffering, but individuals have inherent value in virtue of being a certain kind of creature that we'll see. We'll see what matters for him in just a moment. But it's not just about everyone's interest being equal. It's about everyone's individual value being equal. Okay, and because of that, it would be wrong to disrespect that value. So to treat a person as if they were less valuable, as if they didn't have intrinsic value. For instance, because they were a certain race, or a certain sex, or a certain sexual preference, or a certain utility, right? Certain religion. Well, utility meaning they can do certain things or certain capacities. So treating someone as if they have less value or as if they don't have intrinsic value is bad. Okay, morally relevant factors can be disregarded if we have this sense of individuals sharing some intrinsic value. Or not sharing, but having equal intrinsic value. Okay, this is going to be able to stop you from using people for the benefit of others. Because using someone for the benefit of others is treating them as if they don't have intrinsic value. So we want to get some intrinsic value here. We're more than just receptacles for well-being. We have intrinsic value, Regan thinks. Okay, so now the force of this point here, the inherent value position, is only good if he can tell us who counts. Right? Which individuals have intrinsic value? Okay, because there's a worry here. Maybe you might think only humans have it. Right? All right. So Regan says, what's important is that you're a subject of a life. We're conscious creatures. Okay, we have our own welfare that matters to us. Doesn't matter if anyone else cares about our welfare. Our welfare matters to us. And even setting that aside, just being a conscious creature with an individual welfare gives you intrinsic value. Being what he calls a subject of a life. This is important because the reason he thinks this is important is, one, because it's what unifies humans. An essential similarity between all humans, okay, is that we are subjects of a life with our own individual value. And it also is going to be able to unify other beings. Animals that are farmed, hunted, and researched on or experimented on. It's a unifying feature. Kind of like utilitarians sometimes motivate their view by saying, well, the unifying feature is that we experience pain and suffering. But of course, some don't. And so we're able to kind of get around that by saying, well, here's a different unifying feature, being a subject of a life. Okay. Now, there's nothing that can be a rational ground for this, says, there's no, whether humans can be the only thing with intrinsic value. Regan says, you can't make humans distinct. There's no rational ground for saying that only humans have inherent value while other kinds of sentient creatures don't. Okay, it can't be reason, like higher reasoning, higher cognitive faculties. He says, well, look, you might point to cognitive faculties, the ability to reason, maybe the ability to understand moral reasons, maybe language. But the main objection that Regan has to this is that some humans don't have that, but they still have some value. Singer's just going to deny that. He's a utilitarian. He thinks if you don't have these certain features, you're just less valuable. You're either not valuable or you're less valuable. And he just bites the bullet there. Regan thinks that he thinks that that's wrong, basically. He thinks you're missing this really deep intuition that, for instance, a severely cognitively disabled infant doesn't have any value. That's the wrong result, thinks Regan. He's like, you're missing something. There's still value there. Maybe we should treat it in different ways than healthy functioning infants. Maybe not. But the point is just that because there's a missing faculty there, cognitive faculty, or maybe an inability to experience certain kinds of pains and pleasures and suffering, they're less sentient, you might think. That doesn't mean there's no value there. There's still some intrinsic value. Okay, so it can't be these faculties. Can't be the fact that we're a part of some species. That's not going to do it. That's just like race or sex. It's just a morally irrelevant feature. And he doesn't like the move to souls. Like, well, maybe humans have souls and animals don't. This is kind of a old school philosophy move. Animals don't have souls, but humans do. Well, Regan says that's invoking a claim that's more controversial than the one that it's supposed to support. It's already controversial that humans are morally distinct from animals. Right? It's already controversial. And to say that their intrinsic value is distinct, or that they're subjects of a life in a different kind of a way, he says that's controversial if the reason you think that is because of a soul. How are you going to support a controversial claim like humans have distinct value with an even more controversial claim that it's because they have an immaterial soul? Okay, so he doesn't like those views. You can't distinguish humans from animals. Okay, well, what about them having more inherent value? Not that their intrinsic value is like of a different kind, but they just have more of it. Well, he says, you get all the same problems. What would give you more of it? You'd have to either go to like some faculty like reason, or the fact that we're human, or the fact that you'd have to do the same thing, and you're going to run into the same problems. So you can't get humans having a different type of intrinsic value that ends up being better, or giving humans intrinsic value but not other beings. because the reasons are going to run you into problems. And you can't say that, okay, well, humans and animals have intrinsic value, but humans have more, because you're going to run into the same problems. So what you get is that anything that's a subject of a life has inherent value, and all subjects of a life have equal inherent value in terms of being subjects of a life. Maybe some can experience more pleasure than others, and that will count. But again, this is not a utilitarian view. Pleasure, suffering, those are not the only things that matter. It also matters independently that you're a subject of a life, because that's what gives you inherent value. Okay, so the argument is something like, animals are subjects of a life. If that's true, if animals are subjects of a life, then animals have inherent value. Because, again, he wants to say, this is intuitive, that being a subject of a life gives you value. It's what unifies humans, the way we treat each other, and it's what can unify the way in which we treat other animals. So animals have inherent value. That's modus ponens. Okay. Now, if animals have inherent value, if 3 is true, then animals have the same rights as humans. Why? There's no good reason for distinguishing humans from animals in terms of being a subject of a life with intrinsic value. You're going to get problems if you try to do that. Therefore, modus ponens again, animals have the same rights as humans. All right. And then you might have another claim here. If animals have the same rights as humans, then we should totally abolish animal research. We should totally dissolve commercial animal agriculture. And we should totally eliminate commercial and sport hunting. Okay. Now, Regan addresses a worry about premise 1. Animals are subjects of a life. He's like, well, we don't really know the full extent of which beings have inherent value. So how should we treat ants, flies, fleas, gnats, worms, these kinds of things? Are they subjects of a life? It seems like they are, but at what point does it come in? And that's a really hard question, right? Still, he says, here's what we do know. Most, if not every single one, of the billions of animals that are tested on, hunted, and killed, and eaten in our society, they are subjects of a life. Almost all of them, if not all of them, and at least billions and billions of them are. I should say billions and billions every year that eat in our society every year. So a shitload of them do. That's his point here. Animals are subjects of a life. Someone might say, okay, well, when do you become a subject of a life? How much conscious experience is needed? It's like, okay, fine, we can have that debate, but here's the main point. Billions of animals are killed every year and tested and experimented on who are clearly subjects of a life. So worries about that need to be set aside, he thinks. All right, and then the final points he adds at the end. Look, this does not mean that consequentialism, utilitarianism, right, should be put aside. And it also doesn't mean, I kind of just added that, sorry, that was a reminder from above. It also doesn't mean that human rights need to be set aside. Okay, we can still have a concern for animal welfare. Okay, but also it's grounded in the case for human rights. So he starts with what explains why we think there are human rights. Why you can't just experiment on someone if it'll help 2 other people. Because humans have rights. Why? Well, it's fundamentally grounded in the fact that they're subjects of a life. Okay. Therefore, supporting animal rights is not contrary to supporting human rights. Okay. Secondly, the case for animal rights supports the total abolition of animal testing and animal agriculture, not just factory farming. Okay. And now welfare have a little bit of harder time doing this. Right? Because in animal testing, animal agriculture, I meant to say not just hunting, you get a lot of benefit from animal testing for humans, and we get some benefit, at least things taste good, maybe some convenience. And that's great, I guess. But if you're going to focus on welfare, you're going to be able to appeal to those benefits to keep factory farming, or at least something close to it, around, and animal testing, because you're going to be able to justify the harm done by the benefits to us. And Regan says, well, of course animal welfare counts, but it can't be the only thing that counts if we're going to be really concerned about getting rid of all this stuff. Animal welfare is not going to be enough to do it. Okay, because it's going to be able to allow us to use them as if they're our resources. But that's going to violate their rights. And it's only by appealing to their rights that we can get rid of all this stuff. All right, thanks.